Without the grace of God at work in each of our lives, we are doomed to the consequences of our own sinful behavior. Paul writes in Romans 12:3, "For by the grace of God given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of the faith God has assigned." Not to think of myself more highly. Now, most of us have a healthy dose of pride. It's something we're born with. It continues to grow without much urging as we go through life. However, in the beauty of the transformed life, pride can play no role. After all, we're not in competition with each other or fellow believers. We're saved by God's grace. We're empowered to live by faith for His glory. That's what verse 3 of Romans 12 points out to us. Therefore, not to think of myself more highly than I ought to think, but to think with sober judgment. In other words, don't think you're better than you really are. How highly should I think of myself? Not much in human terms. The ground is level at the foot of the cross for all of us. Each of us are more sinful than we could ever imagine and are in desperate need of God's mercy. Now, we combat prideful thinking by using sober judgment, it says in verse 3. Be honest in your evaluation of yourself. Now, the way that we do this, we use God's standard, and that standard is the measure of faith God has assigned to each believer. Now, the context is talking about various spiritual gifts and how they're used within the body of the church. They're to be used according to the God-given measure of faith. Now, this measure is your capacity to minister to others. Not everyone is given the same capacity, and that's okay. Pride has no role in this measure of faith. It does not mean that it requires different amounts of faith for us to receive salvation, for he's not talking about salvation in this paragraph. He's talking about the evidences of a transformed life, of which a primary evidence is whether or not you are humbly connected to the body of Christ as God has placed you in it. You should ask yourself, am I using the gifts God has given to me to serve the body of believers? This is not according to your own ability, but it's a supernaturally given grace by God. Here's a key thought. Viewing myself through the lens of God's grace controls my pride and enables me to be used of God.